I'm going to start with you, MOSAB, because you've come the furthest, and I think we should start and begin with just the word ethics. Ethics can mean what one ought to do, but it is also about how people behave, what the norms of behavior are, how institutions behave in times. And I think the most important question here of ethical challenges during political turmoil is often people at the heart of turmoil are not asked what is the ethical thing to do. It is reporters and writers around them which are being asked what they should do. But since you are coming from the heart of turmoil in Gaza, where you recently left, coming to Cairo, moving to Syracuse, what do you want people to be doing right now? What do you want writers to be doing?
Okay. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Bookstan, for this incredible festival that I'm part of with this honored panel. First of all, maybe many of you know that Gaza has been under blockade since 2007 and under occupation since before 1948. In this current genocide, there are no international reporters to report from the Gaza Strip because Israel has been closing down Gaza since early October for their fear for the safety of international journalists. But here, I would like to add, from the Israeli fire. So for me as a poet, I thought that it is my duty, it is my responsibility to write about what I'm seeing. Not only that, but what I'm feeling and what I can see in the faces of people around me. So for me as a poet, I became the reporter from Gaza. I did not intend this to be the case. I mean, many times I would write poems about what happened maybe a few weeks later, a few months later. But I found myself writing poems, but not only poems, but I also wrote essays. I wrote Facebook posts. I posted some pictures with some captions. So I can't imagine myself falling silent in front of what I'm seeing, despite the horror of what happened to so many journalists, writers, poets. And I have a very close friend of mine, Rifat El-Arir, who was murdered by Israel in December, just a few days after he called me when I arrived in Egypt. You know, I think Rifat put his life in danger by speaking up, by posting, by being an outspoken poet and professor against the Israeli occupation. I don't think Rifat would just keep silent because he is afraid of the Zionists, although he got so many calls from some extremist Israelis or maybe the Israeli army that they knew. So this is something that his family told us about, which is they called him and they said, "We know where you are, we are going to get you." So this is a university professor. He's a poet and he's a mentor and he's the co-founder of We Are Not Numbers, which was one of the first places that I benefited from as a young writer in 2014. So if you're talking about ethics, it's about, you know, risking your life sometimes. But I don't want to, of course, end my life. But Rifat did it. It seems like he sacrificed his life. And he was staying I think in an UNRWA school with his family. But when he got that call, he didn't want to endanger the people who were displaced with him. So he moved to stay with his sister. And that's where he was killed along with his sister, her husband, their children, and his brother and his wife. So I can't imagine a writer or a journalist in Gaza just staying silent in front of what's happening, especially that there are no international journalists who could be believed as more credible than ours, because our numbers have been doubted, the massacres have been doubted. Oh, this is AI, this is Photoshop. But I mean, I would like from day one, I have hope that some officials from the United States or from Europe would come to Gaza to see with their own eyes. Don't believe us, we are liars. There are no children who were killed. Just come and just look at the destruction there. These people have no ethics. But from day one, and even from before October 7th, they never stopped visiting Israel and offering their support, whereas they dropped food parcels on people, which killed many people, they decently shipped weapons to Israel through airports, through seaports, which will later be dropped on us. So there is no ethics here, but the poets and writers and people who fought for their lives and for their families have the perfect ethics in this life.
We have the beginning of a very dark sort of wartime joke. A journalist, a novelist, and a poet walk into a bar during times of political turmoil. What do? And Peter, one of the lines that haunts me from Love Thy Neighbor is something that someone says to you in an interview, which is, our only weapon is the truth, but it is of no use. And one of the things that MOSAB just said, which is, belief. Belief is one of the key words that factors during ethics, which is how can you create an ethical system when there is a constant attempt to undermine the truth, or people don't know the truth, or they're lacking the sense of truth because they lack a sense of context. And I want to ask you, as a reporter during the 1992 and 93 in Bosnia, how you dealt with those things, because in the book, one thing you dramatize is your disbelief in the beginning, when you talk to people and they tell you things and you said, how can I believe this? How is this not possible? And obviously in the book you could tell more of a story about coming to believe those stories. But in the moment when you're filing a news story for the Washington Post, how did you deal with it?
Well, I started at the bottom or the beginning in covering the war in Bosnia. My first story about the war was from Split, writing, and this was in, I think, May of 1992, a month or so after the war had started, writing about these refugees that I interviewed who had been walking for a month and a half or 2 months to get out of Bosnia. And they were telling me these stories, and I had never covered a war before. I was 32 years old or so. I was based in Budapest, but I was more focused on Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. It was newly the former Soviet Union at the time. And I didn't know Bosnia very well, and I hadn't been to Bosnia before. And these refugees were telling me these stories of, walking for 2 months, of people being shot, people being executed, etc. And I frankly found it unbelievable. And I found it unbelievable because, well, who are these people? As a journalist, you kind of always want to check your sources and, well, I need to find out from other people, is this really true? But also unbelievable in the context of, wait a minute, this is Europe here. Is this kind of thing really happening in Europe? And of course, there had been the war in Croatia, so we had that experience. But to think that, like, this is happening now in Bosnia in a much more vicious way even, was a shock. And in terms of establishing my own beliefs, I was this kind of tabula rasa going into the country. And it was just a matter of just, I guess, classic kind of reporting, talking to people. And, taking, in many cases, the risks that were necessary at the time to, talk to the actual combatants, to see what they were doing, talk to them, and then to be with, the victims who turned out to be either victims or survivors, and see what their conditions were. And then, report it all. And, it was kind of, in a way, it operates now almost as a control experiment to what, MOSAB, you're talking about, because, the Israeli government has, like, absolutely forbidden and made it impossible for foreign journalists to go into Gaza, which, as a journalist who covered the American invasion of Iraq and also Afghanistan, these were countries where it was very difficult to get in. The Americans didn't want us, any unembedded journalists, to go into Iraq. And I found a way, and some other journalists found a way, basically renting cars in Kuwait and driving kind of, in my case, over what was probably a landmine field, into Iraq, sneaking in, pretending to be American soldiers. The American government didn't want that, but it was possible. And it was possible to get into Afghanistan just as kind of there's the Taliban were falling. It was difficult. This situation where there is zero possibility for a foreign journalist to get into a combat zone. I mean, even in Syria, obviously you needed a visa to go in areas controlled by the Syrian government, but there was so much else where you could go and get in because the Syrian government did not control all of its borders. But this, I've never come across it before. I'm just trying to think to myself, what conflict have I been connected to, or do I know of, where there was zero possibility for journalists outside of that area to access it? So it's quite incredible what they're doing. But I would say, on the other hand, you know, there are these Palestinian journalists in Gaza, you know, so many of whom have been killed, what, 200 more? It's vast, who have been doing, you know, the work that journalists do, that foreign journalists would be doing. And of course, like if you had Christiane Amanpour, you know, in Gaza, okay, more people would perhaps be listening and more people would perhaps believe her. But remember, and this is getting back to the point, is the control experiment. You had Christiane Amanpour in Sarajevo. You know, I was in Sarajevo for the Washington Post, and we were reporting, I think, very accurately what was happening. And we were disbelieved. And we were disbelieved, including by people in our own publications. I mean, you know, there were reporters for the Washington Post in Washington who were just talking to US diplomats in Washington, DC, who wanted to pretend that, like, oh, everybody's bombing each other, they're all equally to blame, et cetera, which was total BS. So we were disbelieved. And I think that even if there were, you know, obviously I would like it for foreign journalists to be allowed in there, I'm not sure that the outcome would be a lot different, because very quickly, with respect to what we were all reporting from Bosnia, people got very tired of it. And the pressure on the US government, which eventually led to an intervention and then the Dayton Accords, that took years. So I've kind of given a very wandering answer to your question, but I'll leave it at that.
One of the things that Peter has summarized is that there are many obstacles to truth. Sometimes it's publications, sometimes it's governments, sometimes it's propaganda, sometimes it's the system of information in which these reports are being released into. And obviously we have been marinating in these systems our entire lives, differently in different nations. And Lana, you've been living in Berlin the last year and a half. And you know, you've been going to protests and you've been watching as Germany has its response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the police crackdown on protests. And I wonder if you could just describe your reaction to that. I mean, it seems like with your background, you're not surprised at what it feels like, but people in Germany might be. Can you describe that?
I mean, first, for me, given my background, I found myself in Germany, you know, a published Bosnian writer invited to all these panels to talk about our war. And everybody was like so full of empathy, and you know, it would be like this full rooms, everybody nodding, oh, that's horrible. Almost kind of, I don't know, experiencing some sort of sick catharsis. They're just like, tell us more, tell us more, tell us more. And then suddenly, you know, October 7 happens, and after everything that happened after that, and then you see how there are wars that you can talk about and there are wars that you cannot talk about. And for me, I was just, the hypocrisy was huge. And especially because everybody around me was telling me, you can't talk about this here, you can't talk about this here, you don't understand, as if it's difficult to understand. You know, it's just Germany has this complex history, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we know about your history. We were, you know, part of it, including my own family that, you know, hunted you down hills in Bosnia. We know about your history. And there's this, one of the things in Germany is this abbreviation called PEP, which is Progressive Except for Palestine. So suddenly there was this huge elephant in the room that you're not supposed to talk about, and they painted it as this, you know, we are dealing with so much guilt. And maybe for the first couple of days I believed it. But then you realize that this is not about guilt, this is about money, German weapons being sold, the same companies, like you have, for example, Rheinmetall, which is the company, they didn't even change the name. It was the same company that made weapons for the Nazis and actually used Jewish slaves in their factories. The same company under the same name is now getting rich on this genocide. And another thing I realized, this was the perfect justification for them, for the Holocaust. And the justification is, the Holocaust happened because there was no Israel, not because we were the bad guys, right? And I thought we should talk about this, but pretty soon you get reprimanded as being the bad immigrant, ungrateful, you know. Look, we gave you this, we translated you, we published you, you should be grateful and you should shut up. Except, you know, I grew up in Banja Luka, so I've had my education in dealing with what you're not supposed to talk about with our own homegrown fascists. And it was just, for me, it wasn't even a question of whether to do it or not. Because I have coffee with my friend, Gaia Thalmadhoun, who tells me, at one point I see him and he tells me 49 members of my extended family have been killed. And then I see him again in a couple of months and he tells me the number is now 100. So how do I go from that to having another nice panel, you know, palatable panel about, a war that is accepted and good to talk about, and talk about, how, answer the question of, oh, what is it like to grow up during the war? To me, it's not even a question. It's just common decency and humanity to talk about it, especially while my books in Germany are being sold and those taxes are used to bomb universities, mosques, refugee camps, hospitals, etc. In the end, it's just a question of distance, right? If somebody was murdering a child next to me, would I continue writing my novels? No, you would say, no, you're not a psychopath. Would I give that person money and say, keep doing that? No, I'm not a psychopath. But when it's far enough away, then it's suddenly okay, right? So yeah, it just, for me, made no sense to keep talking about our war or any war and not talk about what's happening right now. Yeah.
And you stopped writing a novel, if you don't, do you mind if I talk about this?
No, sure. Yeah.
You were writing a novel and you stopped. And can you tell me how deliberate or not that decision was?
I mean, as everybody here knows who is in the writing business, it's such an intricate process. I was writing about well, I'm not going to say what I was writing about, but it did take place in Yugoslavia, and it just suddenly the world became too loud. And I could no longer focus on anything else, really, while my friends were being detained, arrested, fired. A lot of them, my Jewish friends, in Germany, because they were being bad Jews. And now suddenly descendants of Nazis were telling them, you're being a bad Jew. You can't talk about this. So when reality becomes too loud, you have to deal with it. So I just decided to start writing something else. Yeah.
Speaking of which, the poem that we heard at the very beginning from MOSAB, the Palestinian painter, it raises an interesting aesthetic question, which has some ethical ramifications, which is when you're from a place which is constantly at the crux of what someone might call political turmoil, there are certain expectations for how and what you write, that you must be expected to provide suffering, perhaps, or witness to suffering, or what Peter calls in his book war pornography, which is a degrading expectation. And you have this painter trying to decide whether to paint a beheaded doll or something else, and your poems beautifully enact that equivocal feeling. They fold from lyrical moments through surreal moments into awful moments. And I wonder how you manage that on the page, or when you are just simply existing as a writer, if you feel angry that you're expected to constantly provide a certain thing, or if you worry that if you don't provide it, people will stop listening to you?
It's very complicated when it comes to writing about horrific experiences like the war. I mean this war, Lana said, our war, as a Bosnian or as a European part of a country that's been under occupation and bombardment. The Gaza war, I mean, if I was still alive, sorry, I was born in November 1992, so around the time that I think the war was ended by the time. Okay, so if I was a grown-up at the time, I would call this my war, the war on Bosnia and other minorities in Europe. I would stand up and call this our war, because this war is against the human in every one of us. And what's happening these days is our war as capital H, human beings. Because what's happening right now in Gaza could be happening to you, because you could be born in Gaza just like me. You could marry a Palestinian man and move to live with him and have children and have the ceiling on top of you. Just like so many, at least I lost 30 members of my extended family in one airstrike in October. And I'm lucky enough to not be in my house along with my parents and my siblings and their children and my old children and my wife. When our 4-story house was bombarded on October 29th, we were in the refugee camp. So my father used to go back and, for one reason, to feed the pigeons and the ducks and the hen and the rabbits that he used to grow for habit. So that day my father returned to feed the pigeons, but I mean the first thing he would look at was where the water tanks on the 4th floor. So he would, just make sure that the house is there. As long as the water tanks are on top of the house, then everything is fine. Because the most important thing in houses is the water. Because Israel steals water from the underground. So we have to store water in water tanks. So my father looked at the house, but there were no water tanks. And then he moved down with his eyes. No 4th floor, no 3rd floor, no 2nd floor. Only the 1st floor, on top of which were the other floors crushed as a piece of biscuit. So I wrote many poems after 2014, because in 2014, I think I discovered myself as a poet. I wouldn't call myself a poet in 2014, because I didn't write that much poetry. And I didn't even know that I was writing poetry, by the way. Because in Arabic, if I was going to write poetry in Arabic, my native tongue, people around me won't believe that this is poetry, because poetry has meter, has to have rhymes at the end of each line. This is Arabic poetry. It's very rigid, but it's beautiful. So I didn't feel like writing Arabic poetry that way. I was expressing myself more in the English language. Because when I write in English, maybe this is a question in our event at 7. Anyway, so I'm answering this if you are going to ask it. So I feel like when I write in English, I'm talking to you. I'm talking to everyone who doesn't speak Arabic or who doesn't have a way to speak to people in Gaza. So I'm talking about my own experience, which is a collective experience. And I'm talking about other people's experiences because they could be my own experience. I survived death at the age of 16. And I wrote a long poem about this called The Wounds. I mean, I could be the other person next to me in the ambulance who had no head. I could be that person. So I wanted to write his poem. So maybe this answers part of your question. The other part is that recreating the horror, not because I wanted to live it, but because I wanted to communicate what it means to live this horror. So in my poems, I'm not only chronicling what happened exactly in front of me, because sometimes my eyes won't be working when that happened. But my memory, my imagination, the feelings that I had over weeks and months during this genocide could help me recreate what happened to me, what happened to my parents, what happened to the 400 people who were killed just 700 meters away from me in Jabalia camp on October 31st. So recreating this, sometimes I would imagine what happened to them. Although I did not see exactly how the bomb fell, what the family was doing inside the room, whether they were maybe boiling some water for the tea. Some of the poems that I wrote 5 or 6 years ago happened in this genocide. For example, What is Home, which was translated into 20 languages. I wrote in that poem, What is Home? The oven that my mother used to bake chicken before a bomb reduced our house to ashes. And this really happened in 2023. Our house was reduced to ashes. Before that, it was not a pile of ash, but it became. So sometimes I feel like I'm writing things, I'm just prophesying, and they happen. Should I stop writing or not? This is the question.
Peter, as MOSAB was talking, I was thinking about one of the things that filtered through what he just said is the question of risk. You know, that he's living through and survived an enormous amount of unchosen risk. And as a journalist, you're often imposing that risk on people you speak to. And in several sections of Love Thy Neighbor, you sort of chase someone down and try to talk to them, and obviously by talking to them, you are putting them at risk. And some people know how to navigate that. They say, meet me here, and you go through a chink in a wall, or you go to a cafe. But one of the ones that stuck with me was you were following a Muslim woman in Banja Luka, and she doesn't want to talk to you because Banja Luka is being ethnically cleansed at the time, and people are being shipped out. And so in your book, because it's not a newspaper, you imagine her life for a paragraph or two, and you describe the things she might have done. And I wonder what your experience as a journalist was like writing that section of your book where you could creatively imagine her life, whereas most of the time in dispatches, you didn't have that privilege.
Well, the real hard part is not the writing afterwards. It was, being there and navigating those situations. When you talk about ethical challenges, for example, yes, Banja Luka. I was there in, I think it was August of 1992, and this was right after the death camps had just been revealed to the world. And I was in kind of like the second very small wave of journalists who were allowed by Karadzic to go to northern Bosnia to see the camps, which he said, oh, they're not so bad. So they cleaned up the camps a little bit, Omarska, Turmoil, and allowed a very small number of foreign journalists to go into them. And even though they had cleaned them up in the sense of like they had halted executions just before we were there, they had taken, the most, on the verge of death prisoners and taken them away and shot them or something like that. Even though the camps had been sanitized very slightly, at least to the satisfaction of the Serbs who controlled them, who thought like, oh, this is okay now. We can show these to the foreigners. So the ethical challenge, I went in there, and I don't even know how to begin to describe, and I know I cannot possibly describe the situation and how wrong and bizarre and challenging it was to me as a journalist with no experience of navigating this particular situation of being in a death camp, because these people were going to die the next day, possibly, after we were gone, or that afternoon. And they took us to the canteen where the prisoners occasionally ate, and had us kind of stand there, and they brought in a whole bunch of prisoners who were, these skeletal men, heads down, not looking left, not looking right, in, absolute, total fear, in jeopardy of their lives. And, and obviously guards were there. And it was the same situation when I went to Turmoil. We also were taken at Omarska into kind of a area where they had bunk beds and the prisoners were staying. And the question then was posed to me, what the hell do I do with this? So yes, I want to talk to these prisoners, of course, find out what is happening, okay? But on the other hand, the moment they open their mouths to me or to any other foreign journalist and say anything other than everything is fine, they're dead. They can't speak honestly. So should you even try? Because even in trying, you are putting somebody in serious, serious, mortal jeopardy, no doubt. And this is just on the fly. I mean, I wasn't prepared for this. Like, okay, we're going to be taken to these camps. I had never been to a death camp. I had never interviewed prisoners in jail, really. And so I just sensed that, like, I can't talk to these people. It's just too dangerous. And they don't want to be talked to. This was so clear, too, that they were eyes down, not looking at us like, please, please don't talk to me. And I remember when we were in this kind of bedroom area, bunk beds, et cetera, there was a TV crew that was in this small group, and there was maybe a half dozen journalists. And they, as an American journalist, had his camera, and with his camera person, and was like, the light was on, and they were trying to interview one of the prisoners. And, you know, I just looked at the man's face, and he was just in, like, the most utter fear you could imagine. Oh, I'm sorry. And he was in the most, and he was in just the most utter fear you could imagine. And I knew, you know, I saw in that instant that, yes, you know, trying to talk to these people here, even though you're a journalist and you want to get the truth, you want to find out what's happening, it's just like, no, you don't do that. I happened to be with a Serbian human rights worker who was working as my interpreter, whom they allowed to come in with us. And, you know, I didn't speak Bosnian. She obviously did. And I gave her a piece of paper and pen, kind of slipped it to her, and said, whatever you can do. Because the guards were all looking at us, the foreign journalists. And so she was able to kind of talk to some people. And one of the prisoners did slip a message to one of the photographers who was with us. And the photographer gave it to me afterwards. And the message was, I forget precisely what, but basically like, they are killing us every day. So, you know, this is a very long, rambling answer that I didn't have the microphone close enough to my mouth for all of you to maybe hear. But, you know, the problem with ethical dilemmas in war zones is that they wouldn't be dilemmas if you could prepare for them and you would know what the right answer is. And so I was very much, you know, learning along the way.
And in that scene, as you can tell, I'm going to talk right into the mic. In that same scene, you describe your discomfort because the only person you can really talk to safely is one of the guards. And you have this odious experience of trying to chat up one of the guards who was wearing black sunglasses and combat fatigues. And you're trying to joke him into talking, and eventually, because you say, it's hot in here, isn't it? And he doesn't say anything. And finally you say, I hear you torture people here, and that gets his attention. And it highlighted the bizarro world in which terrible conflict means that you can only safely talk to the persecutors, not the persecuted.
Yeah, and you know, the advantage of that is that the persecutors, in at least this kind of situation, are not that sophisticated in their messaging. So, you know, you don't even need to hear anything from them to know what was going on. And so in that case, yes, I realized I'm in the canteen talking to the prisoners, just not a question. And so I find kind of the biggest, meanest looking, you know, soldier and try to talk to him, you know. Really hot in here, it was, no response. And then I say to him in English, you know, like, I hear the prisoners are being tortured. And he just like looks down at me, and he is looking down because he's a big guy, and he just sneers at me. Why would we ever want to do that? And it's just like, you know, sometimes the lies are more revealing than the truth. And that was one occasion. And that's, you know, one of the advantages, in a way, of being in a situation when people are lying to you, because they are telling you a kind of truth in their lies. And so long as you know that, and so long as you communicate it in a, sophisticated enough way to your readers or to your viewers, it works. But it's tricky.
Lana, that makes me think about what you've sort of been up to, because I feel like you've been chronicling lies lately. You've been sort of a lie, sort of adjudicator and chronicler and assembler. And obviously, I think in the context of our conversation here, you're very aware that the risk that you face is not death. It's not domicide. It's professional risk. And so you're willing to take that risk because of what you feel ethically is your obligation, which is to speak to what is happening and what is being done, and sometimes in the name of people that you know. So as a chronicler of lies, what have you noticed about their patterns and how they appeal to the ethics of the so-called listener to the lies? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I like this chronicler of lies. I'm gonna put that in my CV or somewhere. Or like a blurb John Freeman said. I mean, it wasn't new to me because of where I'm from, and precisely because I wasn't facing these risks. I just felt I should say something, and also because I was in Germany because I wrote a novel about what was happening in Banja Luka, and I just felt I didn't even think about it really. I think it was the moment when I was told not to, that then the Bosnian in me was like, okay, now I have to, the inat, the spite. I mean, the patterns are always the same. There is, who has the right to victimhood, who has the right to talk about their trauma, who has the right to frame the story. All of this I saw in Banja Luka, the relativization, you don't understand, it's complex, the whataboutism. I grew up on this, so for me it was obvious. Of course, there was another thing for me personally, and I told you this yesterday, I think, which is I'm constantly aware of the fact that the reason I'm alive is that an 11-year-old boy left Jasenovac's concentration camp. And so this is something that has stayed in my family as trauma for generations to come. And for me, I feel like the fact that I exist, then I should speak about this. Then I should talk about this when I see it, when I notice it. And also notice how our world is connected. As MOSAB said, this is our war. This is not something happening somewhere else. Everything we do on a daily basis, especially in Germany, is enabling this. And so precisely because I'm a white woman in Berlin at that point, I felt like, unfortunately, they will listen to me, right? Until they didn't want to listen to me. And when it comes to career, to me it is the arrogance of Germany in Europe, within the literary scene, that if you do not exist as a writer in German, you don't exist. And then I was just trying to say, we have a whole literary scene in Yugoslavia. Like it's, we have amazing writers who are not translated into German. We have a great festival. I don't need you. And I think this is what hurt them the most. This feeling of, what do you mean? If you're not here, like your career is over. And another thing is that it seems like they're not able to think of a person outside of their career. The idea that you would do anything to lose even a bit of money is completely foreign to them. And so I could really understand. I mean, this is going to sound maybe like a lot to say, but in these last 6, 7, 8 months, I understood how the 30s could happen and 40s in Germany. Because I've met people who are not saying anything to save their asses, to save their careers, not even to save their lives, just to save their paycheck. And also I've met people who are not saying anything because they just believe whatever German law and government tells them is right. So yeah, now I'm wandering off too. But yeah, the patterns are unfortunately always the same, right? Fascism in itself is a very, as late Dubravka Grš said, a very stupid ideology. It's not difficult to understand. It's very simple, and it's simplicity that makes it so contagious and dangerous. Yeah.
When Peter was in those camps he just described, one of the things that people did say to you, which is another, there's so many haunting things from your book, but one of the men, he just mutters, Dachau, you know, just to say to the journalist, this is what's happening here. And that those kinds of historical comparisons are exactly what, and I just want to press you a little bit to be really specific, Lana, about what you're not allowed to say in Germany now, either at a protest, publicly, or in print.
I feel like just the word Palestine is forbidden. You know, it almost makes me want to go to like a shopping mall and just say Palestine. Just, you know, it's like they're afraid of it. And then anything else. My friend, who is Jewish, has been fired from the Jewish Museum in Berlin because she was a tour guide, and she said there is an apartheid system in Israel. The next day she was fired. A Jewish person from a Jewish museum. So Palestine, apartheid, even just saying Gaza, talking about anything that happened before October 7th, talking about the victims, the sentence from the river to the sea is seen as anti-Semitic, and a friend of mine whose protest sign read, "From the river to the sea, we demand equality." So not even mentioning, you know, for whom, like for everyone. The police detain her. Whereas a similar sign at a pro-Israeli protest that read, "From the river to the sea, Israel will be free." Nothing happened. So there's a lot of this, just forbidden speech. And it's usually white Christian Germans who are deciding on what is to be allowed and what is not to be allowed. I have another Jewish friend in Germany who's been very vocal about the genocide in Palestine, the police did not allow him to enter a synagogue to pray. German police not allowing a Jewish man to enter a synagogue. I mean, that's how, and if you say something, you're hateful, and there's this what Danilo Kish called paranoia. There's this paranoia, there's this fear, and the same people who organize all those panels with all those Bosnian writers, you know, because they care so much, are the people who are now disinviting us from events, not saying hi in events. It's like you have the plague, basically. Yeah.
MOSAB, I'll never forget interviewing this Chinese novelist Gao Xingzhen, who won the Nobel Prize. He wrote a novel called Soul Mountain, which is about re-education camps. And I interviewed him in Paris, and he showed me a book that was published in Chinese about all the Nobel Prize winners of the last century, and he wasn't in it because what he had written about was something that China didn't want to talk about and didn't want people to remember. And what Lana is describing here is an invisibling of a place, of a people, by use of language. And I'm sure you've read, Peter for 10 years worked at The Intercept, and places like The Intercept and elsewhere have been reporting on these erasures. And the New York Times, there was a leak about the New York Times style sheet, which said that under almost no circumstances should you use the word Palestinian. And so there are people, if you're on Twitter, who have been basically looking at every single New York Times headline about Palestine. And you could probably do this with other conflicts around the globe, but it is particularly acute when it comes to Palestine. And my question to you is, you seem to respond to this invisibling with, okay, I'll do some education. And your book, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, begins with Palestine A to Z. You're a wonderful portrait poet, and so you have lots of poems about your grandfather, which also contain sort of capsule histories. Do you see this work as kind of essential resistance, sort of de-invisibling yourself and your people? And how do you feel about having to do that?
Okay. I wanted to say something before I answer your question about who has the permission to narrate the story. I think that's one of Edward Said's essays, the permission to narrate. So what the Israelis are doing and what other occupiers or colonizers did to the colonized is to kill them, to incarcerate them, to destroy their country, and to not even allow them to talk about this. So many journalists were murdered by Israel, many poets, many human rights activists, even World Central Kitchen people who were, not even, Peter said that, and I said that international foreign journalists were not allowed to enter Gaza. This is not only the case for journalists, but even human rights activists or even volunteers who wanted to help the devastated communities in Gaza. They are not allowed to enter there, except with very rare cases. In very rare, even doctors are not allowed to come to Gaza. So they kill us, they bury us, and they don't want to see the headstones. This is what they exactly are doing. They want to erase you and to erase your name, your memory, everything that testifies or reminds the people that these people were killed by those who used to be victims. I think for me, this is my personal opinion, I think by the time you, as a victim, you start to victimize others, you are no longer a victim. Okay? This is the end of it for me. So I think when I started writing my poetry in English, I was trying to document things that if I did not write about these things, maybe it meant to other people it would mean that nothing happened. So if no one told us what happened in Bosnia, maybe I, as a Palestinian, wouldn't think that so many horrible things happened there. So we are really thankful to the writers, including Peter, who documented the horrors and the war crimes that happened in Bosnia. And I'm really thankful to the people in Gaza, many of whom never even thought of themselves as camera persons or video takers or even writers, who found themselves, just like I found myself writing poetry. This is the case for many of you. Maybe you are an engineer, maybe if you would say, if I was not in Bosnia, maybe if I was born in the countryside in England, I would be a farmer, like Robert Frost or someone else. So for me, I would say the same thing. If I wasn't in Gaza, I would be taking photographs of the oceans around the world. I love to take photos, and there are some photographs in my book. Some of them are of destroyed buildings, some of them are of the sea, some of them are of a mirror that was shattered, and I was looking at the mirror, there was, of course, because the mirror was broken, so I could only see my eye or my nose, but where is the rest of me? It's shattered on the floor. So writing about these things, the first thing, it's about me, because I want to again, document my experience and the feelings that come with this experience. This is number one. And the number two is communicating with the outside world, just like we are speaking right now. Sharing with these people because they have the right to know what happened, because they could learn and they could help stop whatever is happening in Palestine or now what's happening in Gaza. So it's my duty to illuminate people, but in the first place, it's also my duty to maybe to take off some burden off my shoulders by writing these poems. Yesterday, on the plane, I was listening Home, the song Home, the place where I can go to take this off my shoulder. Someone get me home. So I wrote in my own way. I said, home is the place where I can't go to take off all the rubble, to take the rubble off my shoulder. Someone rebuild my home. So it's about trying to build as much as possible what the occupation has destroyed in my country. I wrote poems about my grandfather, about Ghassan Kanafani and one of his work, Men in the Sun, about Mahmoud Darwish, about a friend of mine who visited Jerusalem for the first time for a treatment, and when he came back to Gaza, he died. So even though Jerusalem is just 70 kilometers away from Gaza, I was denied entry to Jerusalem to attend a visa interview just for a few hours and then go back to Gaza. So one time I had to go to Cairo. So I canceled my appointment in Jerusalem. So I booked an appointment at the American Embassy in Jordan. And I thought, okay, maybe the Israelis won't allow me to go to Jerusalem because maybe I'm going to steal something from there. Let's say I'm going to Jordan through Israel because it would be a 2-hour drive. So I applied again and they did not allow me even to cross. So I had to book a flight to Cairo. I paid about $1,200 even to only cross from Gaza to Egypt because the border is closed all the time, most of the time. And then I booked a flight from Cairo to Jordan. So I don't know what to say. I want to just finish by saying that I think it was David Cameron who called Gaza the largest open-air prison in the world. And people, when they think about prisons, they would think about people disallowed from leaving this prison. But in Gaza, it's not only that people are denied exit of this prison, but in this case, and especially now, people are not allowed even to enter this prison. So Peter wants to be, because he is an international journalist, he would like to maybe visit this prison. Not to be an inmate, but I mean to visit, to talk. He's not allowed. Human rights activists have been not allowed. Even Noam Chomsky tried multiple times before 2012, before he came to Gaza in 2012 for the first time. That's when I met him for the first time. So they were not allowed even to visit Gaza for a literary festival. I don't know why. So when I was talking about journalists and doctors and human rights activists, this is one thing. But even why haven't we seen any officials from the United States or from Europe coming to visit Gaza? I mean, why? Just visit. I mean, 9 months. It's been 9 months, about 300 days, and not a single official, not a journalist. We don't want journalists to come. Okay, we can do this, but I mean, come see the camps, talk to the people, what they want. I'm sure if you come to visit Gaza and ask people in the tents, or like my father built something like a small room from 10 sheets that he could salvage from our bombed house. So he built a small room next to our destroyed building. So if maybe you come to Gaza and ask my father, what do you want? I won't tell you that he's going to ask for the right to return to Jaffa, the city where my grandfather was, my 4 grandparents were expelled from in 1948. But maybe they would ask for a lifting of the siege. Maybe they would ask for freedom to movement. So because the occupation is destroying, and these children who are now 4 or 5 years old are not going to remember anything about 1948 or about, Jaffa, Haifa, Nazareth, Hebron, etc. They are now going to think about what happened in Gaza, and this would be the home they want to rebuild. So this is, I think, one of the most heinous crimes that Israel is committing which is erasing the history by creating a new history for people to remember. I think this is something that everyone of us should be thinking about.
Peter, you have a line in Love Thy Neighbor. When you were just describing the destruction of a 600-year-old mosque in, I think it's in Banja Luka, which was blown up by Serbs, and you say something like the goal was to kill history. And I think that must put a journalist in a different position as a journalist. If you're working in an environment in which history itself is at risk, because you're working 900 words, 700 words, you've got to somehow accordion history into a report. You know, if the goal is erasing history, and I wonder how you dealt with that. Obviously, you wrote your book. You wrote Love Thy Neighbor as a way to deal with that, but it's also a book about what people are capable of, and you were trying to make it not simply about the war. But when you were filing your daily reports, how did you deal with the erasure of history?
I mean, off the top of my head, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, when I was working on daily reports, I was just like in kind of animal mode, just reacting, seeing something, taking it in, and then pushing it back out in a story with as much processing as I could do in the moment. And there weren't a lot of moments for processing. So I wasn't thinking in these kind of grander terms. But, you know, when I visited Banja Luka, the mosque was still there. And I sat there with the head of the local community, Muharrem Kurzic, who people here might know. And we knew that he was in jeopardy. We knew that this mosque was in jeopardy. Beautiful old mosque. And indeed, you know, shortly after I left, it was destroyed by the Serbs. And what I wrote in my book is that, you know, and this is where, like, maybe there are some moments when I became a little bit existential, like just looking at and touching these marble stones and thinking, like, some workman 500 years ago put these here, and what they have seen. It's a really, I mean, humbling moment. And it also, however, makes you understand just how significant and kind of what a crime, and it is an actual crime, it is to destroy places like that. It is against the laws of warfare. And it is, you know, very important for an aggressor in that situation to do that. Because they want to, yes, the Serb project, you know, was to kill the military-age Muslims that they could, of course. Get the rest out of there. But they didn't want them to come back. And, you know, how do you make that point really, really, really clear? You destroy the monuments that are particular to the community that you are expelling and killing. And so that was done methodically, as everyone knows, here in Bosnia. The bridge in Mostar is perhaps the next famous example of that. And so, you know, when you see what is happening in Gaza with Israeli forces destroying these buildings, and now there's a little more sophisticated international understanding of, like, what the rules are, and there's more awareness of what the Israelis are doing than what the Serbs were doing in northern Bosnia. And so you just have this absolutely clear evidence of, like, universities, mosques, cultural locations being destroyed for no purpose other than to destroy them, to destroy the history so that the people there who you haven't killed realize there is no going back, or you want them to think there is no going back, because everything, not just their family, even their homes, their places of worship are absolutely gone. And in a strange way, what we've seen here in Bosnia since, and is encouraging, because when that mosque was destroyed in Banja Luka, I think that's it. my God, it's gone forever. But it actually isn't gone forever. It was rebuilt with most of the original stones that were found by members of the community in Banja Luka after the war was over. The bridge in Mostar has been rebuilt with most of the original stones. And it, I can't possibly, and I don't mean to compare, you know, what has happened since the war in Bosnia to what might happen in Gaza and the West Bank after this moment is over, because it's incomparable. But it's not the end. The people who destroy, you know, humans and who destroy buildings do not necessarily have the last word.
I'm going to give the last word to Lana. You don't have to do anything if you don't want to, but I think one of the things that makes these moments of turning possible is obviously a variety of people. And one thing that's an ethical challenge during conflict is who your friends are, who you invite into your life and who becomes kin. And you know, last year or the year before, Adania Shibli was here, and some of you, probably a lot of you know that her novel that she was presenting here, Minor Detail, won an award, which was to be presented at Frankfurt Book Fair, and she was the award ceremony was canceled, and there was an attempt to just basically make her disappear as a novelist in Germany, and she's become a friend of yours, as well as other people you've mentioned in the course of this last hour. After Lana talks, I'm going to open it up to questions from you, the audience. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that expansion of your friend circle has made intellectually, emotionally, spiritually possible for you in terms of seeing your way through this period, because it's obviously ongoing and not soon to end.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I just want to add something that a lot of people don't know, but Litprom, who canceled Adania's award ceremony, they contacted her and asked her if they can mail the award to her building. So this is the German way. We don't even, you know, everything is done behind closed doors. And then Adania said, it's okay, you can just give it to me at the next Frankfurt Book Fair. And they're like, oh no, because then there's going to be another recipient. And she's like, it's okay, we can organize a small event. No, it's better that we send it to you. And then Adania said, should I celebrate with the postman? That is the, yeah. I mean, it is very sad what is happening to Berlin. This idea of a free, beautiful, artistic, cultural hub, which is now being actually revealed as a place that was never truly free. And it was only free for those who were privileged enough to enjoy this freedom. But the Arab community in Berlin is very big. The Palestinian community in Berlin is very big. And some of the people I've met in these past months are probably some of the best people I've met in my life. And I've mentioned Ghayat, who is Ghayat Al-Madhoun, who's a poet. We would gather in his apartment, and he was the only Palestinian. And he would be the most positive one. He would cook for us. He would console us, which is ridiculous. And one night I asked him, how can you be so cheerful? I mean, I'm not expecting you to be this ambassador of grief, but, and he told me, well, this is the first time in Berlin that I see Palestinian flags. This is not new for us. It's new for you, but this has been my whole life. And so there has been amazing solidarity. And I've met amazing people, most of whom are leaving Germany. But I mean, fuck Germany, I'm sorry. You know, like, why do we all have to go to these hyper-centralized cultural hubs? You know, why not do it in Sarajevo? But if you don't mind, let's have MOSAB have the last word, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
I can ask you a question, or you could just respond to to Lana or Peter.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for honoring me to have the last word. I'm sure it's not the last word. There are many words to come. I think when Edward Said was in the United States, he moved to the States in the 1950s. He said that Palestine was a taboo word in America. But now to see so many young generations, so many people from the young generation taking to the street and holding the Palestinian flag and trying to protest in a civilized way on their campuses, asking their campuses to divest from the Israeli companies. I think Edward Said would be very pleased to see that what he was writing in the 1970s and 60s and later has come to good effect, because now we see people shouting Palestine, not afraid to be arrested, or people shouting Palestine, not being afraid to be fired from these jobs, because their jobs is just one phase of their life, but their morality is their life. And I salute you and everyone who stood for Palestine, not because we are unique people. No, our wounds are not unique. Our blood is not unique. But we hate that this has been going on for 75 years without the world even acknowledging that we need a just solution. They are just talking about October 7th or a few days before that or a few days after. But I mean, come on, I really feel really tired and exhausted even to think that I have to explain to people that it's not about October 7th, regardless of what happened on October 7th. But I mean, come on, my life did not, as a Palestinian, did not begin on October 7th. So I have to teach people about history. I don't know why. It's been written about. And our suffering has been documented. And I don't need to start to suffer even to convince people that I need to be given a just solution. I don't need to die under the rubble for people to sympathize with me. Everyone needs to sympathize with others, while even if they have good health, because their right was taken from them. I don't need to be detained for people to love my poetry. I need people to love me because I'm just a human who just refuses to be humiliated, to be dispossessed of his life, because this life again could be your life. And if I was, as I mentioned before, I don't want to repeat myself, if I was in Bosnia and I see my brothers in an X or Y country being dispossessed, I would stand for them. Because they don't have the means to stand for themselves, because they are bombed 24/7 for at least 9 months from now. So again, I would like to thank you and everyone and I would like to tell you that so many people haven't had any electricity, no internet connection, so they don't have that maybe luxury to watch us speak about what's happening, or people going out in the street. I'm sure that people, after this ends, hopefully soon, they will start to watch and read who said what, who did what universities, what students, what ethnicities, what countries had the most active role in stopping or trying to stop the genocide. So people, even my children, now I have 3 children, one is 8, one is 7, one is 4. When they grow up, maybe 20 years later, they would start, or maybe not 20, but maybe in 15 years or 10 years, they would start to read. They would say, oh, this writer wrote about Gaza and he stood for us. That writer didn't say a single word. They will know that. So everything will count. If not now, maybe tomorrow, inshallah, God willing.
And this is why we love Sarajevo, among other things. You've been listening in this heat for over an hour now. Your questions may have evaporated, but if they haven't, Peter, Lana, and MOSAB would be, I think, more than happy to answer them. There's one, in the back with the, yes, I was going to say in the back with the face, but or the glasses.
Thank you so much. A short question and a comment. There were two professional groups since October 7th that have disappointed me mostly. Number one is the academic community, and because it hits too close to home, because I come from the academic community. And we've seen what has been going on in the US with the protests, also in Europe. It hurts me that in Bosnia we have been so silent, so silent. And the other group are the artists. As Lana said, what can you expect from the government? And you said, I was born in Banja Luka, I understand. You cannot expect anything from the media here. We all know you cannot trust the media. You question what media delivers. But the artists were always the beacons of progress, of protest, of challenging society norms. I was just wondering, what happened this time? Is it the money? Yeah. But that is sad in general, because art and money, I wouldn't say don't go hand in hand, but it is not such a natural connection. And just a short comment when it comes to, I would like to circle back to the credibility you mentioned at the beginning. There are no international journalists. There are many, many internationals who are members of the humanitarian organizations, Doctor Without Borders, etc. I don't think there's a single Bosnian that has been personally involved in everything that has been going on since October 7th that didn't think the following. Because during the Bosnian War, we all thought there were not enough information, there were no internet. But today we know we have social media. You can see everything, you see everything. But in spite, so it's not about credibility. There are just, as you said, as Lana said wonderfully, there are some wars you talk about and the others not, and there are some people that are involved in wars, are war victims you talk about and the others you don't. Thanks.
Does anybody want to address institutions letting us down? I mean, it is one part of ethics, which is how institutions create and maintain social norms, which can be beyond damaging. Or just...
This is an issue that John probably knows more than I do, but one of the kind of principal cultural writer institutions in America is PEN America. And there's been a very big controversy in America over the fact that PEN America was very slow and very quiet in its response to all the killing that has occurred in Gaza by the IDF. In contrast, and this is where you have like the perfect control experiment, in contrast to what PEN America said about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you know, I don't know the answer to the question that I'm going to be posing here. John might know more. I mean, what is certainly the case is that the head of PEN America is a former US diplomat who worked in the State Department under Hillary Clinton, and you know, whose views are what you would imagine somebody in that position would have. Whether PEN America's, you know, slowness, it's a very generous word, in responding, and whether the tepidness of its response is because of that individual, or whether whatever individual would be in charge of that organization, the ones that are chosen for those positions would perhaps do the same thing. I don't know. But it has been controversial in America. There were writers that were boycotting the PEN America Festival. So, yeah, even the writers' institutions that are supposed to represent writers can you know, fail just as miserably as the governments. And in this case, the fact that the writer institution is headed by somebody who used to be in the US government is particularly interesting.
Yeah, there's a question over here on the wall.
Peter, you mentioned something earlier. You said that these dilemmas that you face, for example, when you were in this prison camp, the dilemmas precisely because you can't prepare for them. But I was thinking, the Washington Post, for example, they do like to prepare for these things, and I was wondering, as somebody who then went to Iraq a decade later, do you get the sense that it was better, that they're better prepared because of people like you who then come back and say, I didn't know what I was supposed to do? They do care about the safety of their reporters, for example. Is there also somebody whose job there is to take you in a room and say, well, you can do this, you shouldn't do this, revealing sources and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, there is much more attention within news organizations that have the resources on the issue of care and security for their journalists. Mental health care as well as security, making sure that they don't go places they shouldn't go, that they're properly prepared, that they have a plan, and that they can be contacted and all that kind of stuff. With the organizations that have the resources with their staffers, they do take a lot more care. I remember after I'd come back from covering Bosnia for the Washington Post, a couple of years afterwards, the foreign editor, who was the foreign editor when I was reporting from Bosnia, who was a wonderful, wonderful guy, had a retirement party, and I gave a little talk, and I thanked him, for all he did, but I made some mention, which he kind of laughed at because it was normal back then, of thanking him so much for sending me to Bosnia without the benefit of medical insurance. Because that was the way it was back then, that reporters didn't have war insurance, particularly if you were a freelancer. It's much better now. But I mean, I think that's just of a much lower order than like the care for the individuals who are actually there. I kind of, I'm a journalist and I talk about these things, but I'm kind of, less concerned in a way for the safety of the foreign journalists who go there on their own volition, with more preparation, which they do have now. But I'm less concerned about that than about the people who are there, obviously.
I just meant, like, in general, like, do you feel like the guidelines are better in terms of the ethics? Do they prepare you better in terms of ethics now than they used to?
Well, yes, but there's not that many they there. Because there are so many fewer news organizations that have the resources to properly prepare people. And so, and what is also very good, contrary to the way it was back when I was a journalist, is that it is journalists in the countries that are reporting on these situations, not foreigners like myself who parachute in. So they know better, security-wise, what's going on than somebody who would parachute in, and they don't need that kind of preparation. And ethically, they can read situations much better than somebody like myself who doesn't even speak the language. So yeah.
There's a question right. Yeah, there's a question. Man with his hand up.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Before I ask my question, I'd like to start by saying this. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said that whoever believes in God and the last day should speak good or remain silent. Now, silence is a very difficult notion in the modern world. There was one thing that was mentioned, or a couple of things that were mentioned in the panel, which is the lack of, or rather the censure of the usage of the word Palestine in Western countries. Now, there were a lot of rallies in the United States recently, and we had Dr. Norman Finkelstein. Dr. Norman Finkelstein is one of the most famous activists for Palestine in the world. He held a speech for 40 minutes in a rally where they used to say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. He advised the people to simply change the slogan to, from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, focusing on the humanity, right, on the human beings. Now, one thing that I noticed is today, there was mention of the censure of the word Palestine 5 times, and the mention of the censure of the word Palestinian once, which implies that perhaps if there's a shift in the usage of language from the side of rhetoricians, such as yourselves, there might be a lot of benefit in that. One more thing that I'd like to mention, and I'll just pose my question briefly, and I apologize for taking your time, is that in ethical discourse in Islam, for example, which is the prevalent religion of the Palestinian people, is to take action with our hands, to stop injustice and evil with our hands. If we're not able to do that, then with our speech. And if we're not able to do that, then with our hearts. So, since we don't live in a world where we can just stop things with our hands, do you believe that this should be our priority, to get people to focus on handling the situation, getting everything that we can do to be done to stop the tyranny? And do you believe that a shift in the language that we use, where we focus on humanity, saying the word Palestinian more than Palestine, would be useful in speeches such as these? And yeah, that's what I would like to ask. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You hear me? Okay, thank you for your question. I don't necessarily agree with Norman Finkelstein, but with his use of Palestinians instead of, I mean, because there couldn't be a Palestinian without someone coming from Palestine. So you can't say a Bosnian who lives on the moon. I mean, a Bosnian lives in Bosnia. So I think this evasion of the word Palestine is wrong, because we can't give on Palestine, because that's where we were born, and where our grandparents and 100 great-grandparents were born. So we don't have to try to go with the stream about this. We have to challenge it, because there is Palestine. And this is the Zionists, I think it was Golda Meir, who said there is no Palestinian. There are no Palestinians. So by saying this, she said that if you say that there are no Palestinians, then it means that there is no Palestine. It was just a land without a name. So asserting the fact that there is Palestine and the people who live there are Palestinians, no matter how many people or what kind of people or what, regardless of the people who came to live on this land and occupied it and expelled the native population there, it is still Palestine, no matter how long or how many people came to live on this land. Yeah, that would be my answer. We don't have to go in the same line as what people are expecting us to do. We need to challenge it, because if you are going with the stream, then it will take you somewhere that you can't go back to your starting point, which is Palestine.
Anyone want to address the second part of the question about the ethics of change versus speaking versus the change inside oneself that one can affect through forms of action which are not about doing, but perhaps reading and informing oneself? Peter, you address that in your book, where you talk about, at one point someone tries to ask you to take a diploma to his relatives, and you struggle with that because you feel like that's stepping outside of your neutral role as a journalist. But surely as you were writing your reports, you must have at some point thought, if I report this, maybe the US will get involved. You know, it seems like as a journalist, these questions have to be very present for you.
Yeah, well, that was Muharrem Kurzic, the kind of head of the Muslim community in Banja Luka, and he asked me when I left to bring out this diploma. I forget if it was his diploma or one of his children's diplomas that was like, they needed that. That's like, these are the things that people, as you all know, what do people take with them when they have to leave in a hurry? And in Bosnia, very often it was like these papers, these diplomas, to prove who you are, which is kind of a weird, horrible thing to have to do after already being substantial in life. And I didn't take it out because I said to him, I'm not, I'm a journalist, I'm not supposed to do that, because then I could be helping you and I could be accused of whatever. And he's like, it's fine, I understand. And then a number of years later, I saw him. And he was like, totally understood what you did. He said, actually, I did have a secret message in there that I needed to get out to people. And so that was, kind of but like the ethical things, like, yeah, I mean, there were so many things I did. It was for me as an American journalist, kind of with the typical American journalist mindset, you know, to be objective, don't take sides, just report the facts. One side says this, one side says that, which I kind of had bought into up to that point. When I got to Bosnia, it was just like, that was blown wide open. Like, and I argued with my editors about this because when, you know, bomb went off on Marshal Tito Street, you know, however many people killed, I'd report that. And, you know, Mladic Kardzic would say, oh, well, that's the Bosnian army bombing itself again. And my editors required me to like report that, which is okay, fine, that's what they say, but without saying really which was true. And I knew which was true, everybody knew which was true, but I couldn't kind of like present that in the context that it demanded to be presented in, which is one of the reasons why I stopped covering the war, because I couldn't do what I wanted to do. But there were, you know, other kinds of, you know, ethical things. Like, for example, when Yaitsa fell in the fall of 1992, and there was this, you know, exodus of people from Yaitsa, tens of thousands. I went past between Novi Travnik and Yaitsa to kind of go as far close to the front line as I could to talk to the refugees as they're coming out. And this was my kind of like most impactful experience of refugees, because it wasn't like in a sports stadium in Split where they finally have enough food and they can rest. This is the Trail of Tears. This is what you were seeing also in these still going on every day in Gaza. You know, the advantage, if I could say that, in Bosnia was that for the most part these people just had to be refugees in transit once or maybe twice, whereas in Gaza today it just seems to be nonstop, one place to the other. But what I want to say is that I would stop and talk to refugees, and you know, they had nothing, okay? And when I say nothing, I mean, you know, they were carrying what they could, their documents. I stopped and talked to one person who had a briefcase. He was a music teacher, he told me. I said, what's in your briefcase? And he said, it's my music. That's what was most precious to him. And it was just, anyways. And so I'm standing there, you know, with my flak jacket, with my American passport, and in various different parts strapped to my body, thousands of dollars, thousands of marks. Dollars were useless. And, you know, you're a cardinal rule in American journalism and in generally in journalism, you don't pay people for interviews. I mean, actually, people do that in Britain and other places, but you're really not supposed to, because then people say what you want, what they think you want them to say, etc. But I'm standing there with thousands and thousands of Deutschmarks strapped to my body, in my pocket, you know, as many dinars as, you know, thousands of dinars were worth about 50 cents or whatever then, but nonetheless, I had dinars too. And what do? You know, it's like, okay, you've had the interview. These people have nothing. They don't know. They have no food with them. They have no money to get food because they've been living off of whatever resources they have in Yaitsa under siege. And, you know, I gave money to these people, you know. Some of them actually said, no, please, no. But others accepted it, you know. And, like, I broke every rule in the book, you know. But it's just like, come on, you know. There are rules, and then there's, you know, being a human being. So, and that was something that, like, you know, it was on the spot where you're kind of like have to make these decisions. And, you know, there are things that I did or didn't do that I kind of regret. There are things that I'm glad I did. And that's one that I'm glad I did.
Does it work? A question for MOSAB. For a person from Gaza, leaving the governments, the institutions, and mainstream media aside, do people in Gaza realize the magnitude of the support and well-wishing they had from the world? I mean, I'm talking about constant protests in Sana'a, in London, million people weekly, that's half of this country, Spain, Latin America, Africa, all over the world. And do they does it give any comfort? Because to us, during the war, during the siege, it made it meant something.
Thank you for your question. I mean, one of the first things that Israel did was to cut off electricity, to cut off water, to close the borders. So just for your information, there are just 2 individual border crossings in Gaza. Neither of them are controlled by Gazans. So one is between Gaza and Egypt, which is called the Rafah border crossing, and one is called Erez, which is between Gaza and Israel. And the first thing Israel did was closing the borders. And by the way, I mean, this is something that I learned later. I'm going to answer your question, but these are important. This is important information for everyone. Is that after 1993, there is an agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis that the Rafah border crossing is a Palestinian-Egyptian border crossing, but is supervised by Israel. So Israel decides whether MOSAB, even though I'm going to Egypt, let's say for treatment, to attend a visa interview at the American Embassy in Cairo, Israel would decide whether I could leave or not. And they could decide whether I can return or not. So this is one thing. So the closure of borders, the cutting off of electricity, of water, etc. They also targeted internet companies, telephone companies. So I would like you to imagine for a moment that, God forbid, you were in a building, just like our house, a 4-story building. It was bombed. You were in the first floor. It was not touched, but everything is closed. You are under the rubble, but you could still breathe. There is no phone to call to the ambulance. There is no fuel for the ambulance to come to you. So this is one of the most horrible nightmares that I lived in. What if the house I was living in, or the school shelter I was staying at, was bombed by Israel, and I survived, but I remained under the rubble. And that happened to so many people. Well, I think we have the example of the little girl Hind and her cousin, who were in a car trying to run away from the bombardment, and their family members were killed. And Hind and her cousin were on the phone calling the Palestinian Red Crescent, and they were shot at. And 10 days later, people were able to find the car where Hind and her family were in, and the ambulance which raced to rescue Hind and her family. The paramedics were killed, both of them. So the lack of communication. I think Hind was lucky even to talk to people, or her cousin have the luxury of having a phone signal, even to call the ambulance people. So when people don't have food, they don't have water, they don't have internet connection, they don't have electricity. So I'm now, as a poet, I'm thinking about when was the last time I turned on a light in Gaza, or turned it off? No, 9 months. I mean, I've been out of Gaza for 7 months, but I mean, even for my family, because there is no electricity. So the last time they pressed on a button to turn on the light was 9 months ago. And I think many of you know that in Gaza we had electricity for 6 hours a day, and then 12 hours no electricity, and then 6 hours. So it was not very bad. It was very bad, but it was not very bad compared to the current situation. So whether people in Gaza watch, the rallies, the protests, they know. I think many of them know. I mean, by the way, many of my friends, when they talk to me on the phone, I subscribed in Skype, and I bought an American number even when I was in Egypt, so that I could call my family in Gaza, because I could catch a signal in Gaza using my American number. So some of the time when I talk to my friends or my family, they ask me, is there any news? They don't know anything. So they ask me, is there any news? So today, by the way, just a few hours ago, at 5, I was awake. I talked to my friend in a tent in MAASS Khan Yunis. It was 6, so Gaza is 1 hour ahead of us here. So he said he heard some tanks and some bombing around him. And he said, wait, I should check the news. Maybe there is a new order by the Israelis to evacuate the area where we were in. So people would learn whether the area where they are in is dangerous or is going to be dangerous from the news. Sometimes they would ask me, is there any news we should know? So they didn't have access, unfortunately, to watch and see us talking here. Because they don't have access to internet or to news channels to learn what's happening around them. So people sometimes would learn that they lost maybe a family member a few months after they lost him or her, because there is no communication. And now with the dividing path between the north and the south, because Israel divided, I mean, Gaza into two parts, and people like my family who are living now in the north are unable to go to the south, even though it's no safe. By the way, in early October, I was asked by so many friends, like David Remnick, Mary Carr, they would ask me, Musab, why are you not moving to the south? Because Israel is telling you, why don't you do this? I asked them two questions. Do you guarantee that I will make it to the south and not be bombed on the way? Okay, no answer. And then I asked them, is there any guarantee that Israel will not bomb us more easily in the north, in the south, sorry. They did not have an answer. And that's what happened. And many people in the south who moved, who left the north in October and November are regretting having moved to the south. They want to go back to the north, even though there is more starvation there. But they want to be there because the situation in the north and the south are different. So I'm not going to go into details, but there is a lot of difference between what people are experiencing in the north and what they are experiencing in the south. But generally, people who left the north for the south regretted it. They wanted to go back to the north. And this is what people are, thinking about. Of course, they know about the protest, the demonstration, the sympathy, the solidarity movements around the world. But this is not their immediate, concern, because this, unfortunately, is not bringing an end. It will. It might, yeah. I'm sure maybe in a few years, hopefully in a few months or weeks, that there would be a just solution to the Palestinian case, which I doubt will happen very soon. But I mean, at least the perspectives of the people start to change. They are encouraged more and more to read history and read the testimonies of the victims. So hopefully that this will change, inshallah.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have at this point. MOSAB's book, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, is translated into Bosnian and available at iBook, as well as Lana's books, including in English, Catch the Rabbit, and Peter's book, Love Thy Neighbor, is translated into Bosnian. If what we talked about engaged you, please go get their books, and you can continue to live in this conversation. I want to thank you, Peter, Lana, and MOSAB for this incredible hour and a half. Thank you for listening.